here with Clowns Without Borders, and today we're talking about the early days of Clowns Without Borders with Moshe Cohen, David Lichtenstein, and Rudi Galindo. To start, panelists, I'm going to have you introduce yourselves and say where you are, who you are, and then either what you do now or what kind of clown you used to be. And David, I'm gonna see you smiling, so you're gonna go first.
Couple of months of virus and it's used to be. I'm David Lichtenstein, also known as Leapin' Louie in the street circus world. And Moshe got me involved in Clowns Without Borders USA back in 1998-99. Thank you, Moshe. I've been to 7 or so countries with Clowns Without Borders and done a lot of projects.
Hello, everyone. Bienvenidos, and thanks for joining in. I'm Rudi Galindo, and I am one of the old timers. And again, thanks to Moshe for inviting me way back in the late 1990s. And so right now I'm living in Brussels, and I'm also working with the Belgian Clowns Without Borders. I've been on some missions here because there's a lot of immigration issues in most countries here. So I'm spending a lot of time going to refugee centers, and also just recently been asked to be a master teacher for them, and been doing some coaching and some directing and some teaching. So I'm still very much in the mix of things. My specialty is in Chiapas, Mexico, where I first started doing Clowns Without Borders. Those were like the early days for us, and that was during the Zapatista revolution. And I bought a house there, and I try to go back every couple of years. And when I go back, I ask the Clowns Without Borders if they want me to do a training mission. And so that's kind of how I've been involved with Clowns Without Borders USA, is being sort of a clown mentor, clown teacher, clown director there in Chiapas. And I've had the privilege of working with 20 to 30 clowns coming for the first time on tour. And I would say a good percentage of them are still involved with Clowns Without Borders.
I am an illusion, and I am sitting here in my house in San Francisco. Well, it's not a house; it's a studio space, and yeah, I do like to be a funny person on stage, and I like to teach people to be funny, and that's what I do most of the time when I can. And then the Clowns Without Borders, actually, Rudi's house in San Cristobal, or outside of San Cristobal, is almost next door to a woman who passed a few years ago named Alejandra Alvarez, who's a dear friend, who was a dear friend. And she is responsible for everything I do in that realm, because in 1986, up at Camp Winter Rainbow in Northern California, at Wavy Gravy's Camp Winter Rainbow, I met her there, and we were talking about the work I did, and she was telling me about the work she did, which at the time was, she was part of the Seva Foundation, and she was working with 3 communities that they had reestablished, 3 Guatemalan communities that had fled the Civil War, that they had reestablished in Chiapas. And she was the liaison and the organizer for all of that. And she told me about this and says, wow, that's so amazing. I wish I could help, but I really have no idea what to do. And she just looked at me and said, clown. And I went, oh. And that was in '86. And then the next year, I went to visit her in Chiapas and San Cristobal, and she took me into those communities where she was working, and I did shows there and had this, I was amazed at a lot of aspects of what happened and wanted to continue that work. And I did. I went to South Africa for 2 months in '92 to work with homeless kids or street kids, really. And then to do a tour of township schools. And then I worked with Wavy Gravy. We went to the Caribbean, into these extremely poor neighborhoods, into the schools there. And then Clowns Without Borders started by Tortel Poltrona in '93. And that was, I heard about it and I was like amazed and bewildered. And in '94 I joined a trip with the French Clowns Without Borders to Croatia and Zagreb, and that's what set the ball rolling, really.
So what was your first Clowns Without Borders experience?
I want to add to Rudi's bio, for all of you clowns who've performed the newspaper routine. I was created by Rudi. And Moshe, that's interesting. So you went and kind of started it in Chiapas several years before the first Payasos Sin Fronteras projects in the Balkans.
Right. Yeah, I did 6 years or something like that. And there's a not to ignore Naomi's question. No, but I think we should give credit also to the Women's Circus and the Jugglers for Peace, who did projects in Nicaragua and in Cuba in the early '90s, and who also, and I don't think they're the only people who've done that kind of work. I'm sure there are other people we don't know about. As far as getting the ball rolling, yeah, the French were going, and the Swedes had joined the Spanish in '94. To create organizations, and I went with the French to Croatia, and I asked Tortel about setting up Clowns Without Borders in the US, and he was all for it. And so in '95 I declared that that's what I was doing. In '96 I went back down to Chiapas, and then I started inviting other people, and it wasn't until '99 that David and Rudi came with me on a trip to Chiapas. I believe it was '99, the winter of '98, '99. And then they went without me on other projects back to Chiapas and invited other artists. And that really just amplified and expanded from there. And for many years, both David and Rudi were going to Chiapas as well as myself. So we had quite a project there. Yeah.
Rudi, what do you have to add to that?
What was the original question?
Nobody remembers. So you can how you first learned about Clowns Without Borders, or
obviously it was Moshe, of course, who created the ball for us to start to roll. Initially, I wanted to go with my company, Los Payasos Mendigos, and there were 4 of us. And Moshe had asked us a number of years before, but we could never get all 4 to agree to go to Mexico. And so I ended up just saying, well, I'm just going to go by myself. And of course, Moshe was there, and then and David arrived. And I would say that, in the early days, we were learning how to present ourselves to these indigenous communities, because not very often will performers go to these communities. So they also had to get used to watching us perform and understand the etiquette. Not that they needed an etiquette so there were some very strange things that was made us wonder and question our, our humor. And that was that they didn't laugh or they didn't clap when you were expecting them. So we would do like something that in any other country you would get a big reaction, and they would not react. And then we would, especially jugglers, they would do something that was very, very difficult, very virtuosic, and then they would finish it, and then they would be expecting some kind of an applause, and nothing happened. It was really, really strange. And then, we would continue with our show, and then at the very, very end, we would finish, and then they would come up to us and say, why are you stopping? Why are you leaving? And they would, and then we also learned from that the show never ended. As long as once you arrived on the scene, you were on, and it didn't matter if you were in costume or not. You just started animating and doing little tricks that you could. And next thing you know, it's like people, they follow you to where you're going to dress. And then you have this energy of people just wanting to, they're so hungry that they just were just, they wouldn't allow you to even just take a break. We realized two things. One is that you were always on, and the show never ended until you left the village. And number two, don't expect and don't play for applause or laughter. Just be and let the material transcend, custom. And so this was for me, and for, when I bring people to Chiapas, to do these expeditions, these training expeditions, that's something that they have to learn, that they're always on, and that people will, react differently, and not to take it personal that you're not doing a good show.
Yeah, they don't have that. They don't have that culture of applause. I remember in '96. So in '96, that first time I went back to Chiapas, I was performing with Eduardo and Syria from Mexico City and 3 Italian performers, and we were going to the major Aguascalientes, the main gathering places of the Zapatista communities, and we did our first show in Oventic. And we did like an hour and a half, and there was no applause. There was some laughter. The women would laugh. They weren't supposed to laugh in public, and so they would hide their faces. The men would kind of emit these high howls, like high wolf sounds. I can't make that sound. I don't know if Rudi.
I can make it.
Go for it. Go for it. And you'd hear these, and you know that you were being funny because they were losing it. And but anyway, so we did an hour and a half, and we left, and we went to hide behind this hut, and they came and asked us, "Are you done?" A guy with his Zapatista bandana. "Are you done?" I said, "Yeah." "Why? Did you want more?" "Oh, yes." Anyway.
David, I now want to know if you have a story of an unexpected audience response. But first, Hillary actually commented that she was at the press conference in Barcelona in 1993 when Tortel announced that CWB was happening. And Tim says that it's nice to see you together. But David, what was a moment of unexpected audience reaction?
All those first projects were in Mayan lands, and the Mayans were, I remember them laughing a lot, and with that high squealy laugh that was so unique. And they were also very shy for bringing on stage as volunteers. So I remember even in later projects, even after a few years, on my first show of a project, I would move too suddenly towards the audience to get a volunteer, and 40 people would stand up and run away. And then I would remember how it works in Chiapas, that you really have to just ease into bringing a person on just so slowly.
Rudi and I had a handshaking strategy, as I recall. We would go down the line and just start shaking a bunch of kids' hands, and then at one point Rudi and I said, "This one, yeah," and we would take the kid out. But once they were out, they were fine. It was just kind of like the concept of being a volunteer was
in Palestine, it was the opposite, that we had to be very tricky with bringing volunteers up on stage. Like if we were playing a school, 500 kids, because if you pick one kid, every kid, like hundreds of kids, rush the stage wanting to be on stage, and you have to take time to resettle the audience.
How did you plan tours? So that question is coming up, but first, Rudi, I see you waving at me, so it's back to you.
In Nepal, we were performing for tens of thousands, and volunteers were, you try to get a volunteer, and of course, everyone goes, okay, everyone goes on the stage. And there they had a rather, it was really horrible. They had bamboo sticks, and they had these guards, and they were just whacking the hell out of kids and old ladies and whoever was like coming on the stage. And we're like horrified, we're performing, and all of a sudden there's, like 5 guys with bamboo sticks, like whacking kids just to get them back. And they're telling us, yeah, keep going. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Cultures and enthusiasm and audience participation. It's just like a roller coaster. You have to really be aware of how to solve the riddle of, to get a volunteer or not to get 20 volunteers at once.
The model that we used was that the artists would raise money for the project, usually through benefits or personal monies, as I recall. And in the early days, we would just go down to San Cristobal de las Casas to speak with Carlo Romo, who was the head of the Catholic Human Rights Centro de Derechos Humanos San Bartolomé de las Casas, and he within 1 or 2 days would have a 2-week schedule with 2 shows a day, after the first years we started communicating with him a little ahead of time, saying we're coming, but it really didn't matter that much because things were pretty fluid and would change, and that's probably the main way we would, for Chiapas, as I recall, that we were organizing at the beginning. Then we started working with a few other organizations whose names are escaping me, and we'd let them know we're coming, and they would kind of organize the tour down there. David, maybe Rudi, do you have things to add?
Well, we each fundraised those. So when Moshe asked me, I had a fundraiser show in my house and took that money and bought a ticket down there. And that was the first of 21 years of Portland benefits now. So that's a tradition. And we've had tons of people in those benefits who have gone on projects on their own. Michael might be listening. So he and Sarah Leona Foster got involved in the 2nd or 3rd year. They went on tons of projects. And lots of other people have too. I remember my first project in Haiti. I went without any particular sponsor, but just a list of contacts. And I got to Haiti and just started phoning contacts and made a schedule myself. And then I was always bouncing around on the taxis in the back, trying to speak French with people speaking the Haitian accented French, arranging shows. And the first couple of days it was hard, but then 3 or 4 days in, the word got around, and we had 3 shows a day, and we're turning down shows all over the place. Usually there was on the ground NGOs who were doing most of that work for us.
Sometimes it would be very, Rudi mentioned the Bhutanese refugee camps in the southeast of Nepal. And the first time we went there, it was because I was there in Nepal, and so was a Spanish group, and we both had different projects. And we found out about these refugees, and there were 100,000 refugees in 7 camps. And we rented a bus, and once we got permission for the camps from a local organization, and we just went there.
The first Guatemala projects were organized by Peter.
This is, how do you know what to play, and how do you make a plan and then change the plan? And do you have any stories of a performance where you went in thinking this is what we're doing, to then shifting it?
Because there was mentions about how we would juggle, and they would just kind of look right through it. And my first experience in '87, when I did those first 3 shows, and I was a juggler who was funny, and the people were just staring at me. This was the first village. There was like 60 or 70 women and children. The men were still working in the fields, and they had never seen anything like this. And that was our experience a lot. They'd never seen a juggler. They'd never seen a performance live. And so whether I was doing fancy tricks with the 3 balls or just juggling simply, they could not tell the difference. And they didn't understand to applaud. And I did all kinds of different tricks, trying to get them to laugh. And then I started doing sleight of hand for the kids, and the kids started giggling. Then the mothers kind of pulled them in close and told them not to laugh. And I was like really kind of worried. And then finally I was trying to juggle 5 balls, and the balls were really slippery, and I couldn't do it. And I started getting angry about not being able to juggle. I mean, in a clown way. And that's when they started to laugh, was when I got angry. And that was very funny. And that's when, and no one had ever talked to me about cultural sensitivity or cultural awareness, but really that's what it comes down to. I think that we've all found that when we stick to something that's very human, there's no problem understanding us. It's when we get caught up in doing tricks that it doesn't work. Like the chase scenes in Chiapas were always extremely popular. We would chase each other around, and they would get out of the way, and also laugh hilariously. Something that Western audiences probably wouldn't find funny at all. Yeah.
David, do you remember I think maybe the first time that we started doing the newspaper routine, I was, it was like, okay, let's do it, and let's not rehearse. Let's just do it. So I'm like speaking through my teeth. Okay, David, sit down. David, take my hat. David, and so I'm speaking him through this. And so that it became like we were, and no one understood English. So it was like, not that I had to even do that. And then it got to the point where we realized that when you bend over and you present your butt to another clown, that clown is obliged to kick you in the butt. And so we were always like, like saying to each other, David, kick me in the butt. And, it is just hilarious that we're like, the improvisations that worked, we just kept doing them until, we got tired of them. The audience would never get tired of them. But I wanted to speak about the early days when we were performing, and because the 3 of us had never performed together, so we were all strong solo performers. So we ended up just saying, okay, for the show, this is a list of stuff that we can do. So David, you go first, and then Rudi, you go second, Moshe, you go third, and then and so we were taking turns. And it was always kind of odd to be a clown waiting for your chance to go on stage, because there's no place for you to there's no backstage. So after maybe a couple of shows like this, I said, I have some material that could work as like a duo or a trio. So I ended up just taking my solo show and all the things that I've done and just kind of imagined how I would invite another clown to, participate. So instead of me doing all the parts to the show, we would, I would do the first part, and then the clown would do the next part, and then, and so on and so forth. And we realized that this was a great way of integrating, all three performers, so that we were performing the same show, not doing, separate solo shows. And that was kind of a lesson that we learned early on. And it's, and for me, the elements of ensemble work is paramount. It's essential, especially when there is no backstage. You're on stage and people are looking at you, and how you give focus to the person who has focus is just as, and well, it's not as important, but it is very important. And so that's something that, we had to learn, not the hard way, but just it was, it kind of made sense.
I remember being taught newspaper in front of an audience very well. And I tell that to people when I teach it to them. And in workshops, I teach people newspaper that way. Although I think on Clowns Without Borders projects, we always run it through at least once before the show. But and I've taught newspaper to, for years, I always brought new artists on every project, basically, all the ones I organized. And so I taught newspaper a lot of times myself, and I created a couple other skits that were just, improv skits, clown workshop improv tortoise skits that I would just teach people each time. Saida, it may be listening, the first project in Guatemala. Yeah, hi Saida. She was like kind of saying, I'm not a clown, I'm a physical theater actress, and didn't even like clown. And so she had an old woman's mask, and we're like, okay, well, we'll just put some old music on and send you out and find a man to dance with and go slow. And that turned into such a great piece. We did all the time. It was a hit. That I got an old woman's mask, and then I'd start having people do that on projects regularly. So we just...
I probably should have done this a while ago. Chia, thank you for the reminder that not everyone knows what the newspaper act is. And I know we would maybe spend the rest of our time if I asked each of you what the newspaper act is. So I'll give a summary and you can all think that I'm wrong. The newspaper act is one clown wants to read a newspaper, and the other clown or clowns also want to read the newspaper, or they want the first clown's attention. And then there is a struggle, a chase of one clown taking the newspaper, the trickster taking the newspaper from the serious clown. I have had the pleasure and stress of learning it as it was being walked through by both David and Michael, who have different ideas of what the choreography is. One would be muttering one thing, and the other would be saying something else. But there's a lot of fun of what you can do with the newspaper, and newspapers also, they rip. You can have a big chase, and there we can see in a lot of Clowns Without Borders photos over the years a newspaper, because they're also a pretty easily available prop. Which I guess you are each welcome to debate what the Newspaper Act is, but we also have a question from Rebecca of, do you have any rituals for how you prepare before performing? And then also, has that changed? And Moshe, because I think you have a few rituals in your life, we'll go to you.
Yes, I have a ritual of straightening my hair before I perform. I think that I don't recall any specific rituals. I think what develops quite well between the group is usually some form of togetherness and connecting before we go and get on stage. But I don't really think there's anything specific. And same afterwards. But afterwards, as I recall, sometimes it'd be pretty chaotic, just trying to gather the props so that the kids aren't playing with the props, and say hi to all the people who usually want to come. Sometimes it's really insane. In Nepal, in those Bhutanese refugee camps, I got so swamped, the kids, we played for thousands at a time, and they would just all rush in at the end of the show. And I at first I was naive enough to give my hand out, but then there would be like 10 little hands grabbing my arms and pulling out of my socket kind of. So I started saying namaste, and then they would all say namaste, and then I would say namaste, and then they would look at me like, what's he doing? And then they would try it, and they go namaste, and then I would go, okay, namaste. And so we had fun. And I think that probably after the show ritual is connecting with the community or with the audience.
Didn't have a pre-show ritual, and I'm just a street performer. I hadn't gone to that much. I hadn't really gone to theater school at that time where you did those things. So we would just check in with each other, and even that not in a formal way, and try to find a place to get into costume or put makeup on. But sometimes you're getting watched while you do that too, so you just have to play through it. And then like Rudi says, it's not over till you get in the car and leave. So my kids came on one of those early ones. We were talking about that. We wouldn't allow that to happen anymore probably, but my 8-year-old and 9-year-old came on an entire like 20-day project, doing a ton. And they said at one point, now we know what it's like being the Beatles, because they're just get followed around and have to keep on performing until you leave. One time we had been doing terrible drives and lots of shows, and I tried to go out and buy some Nestle's eggs with a toy inside as a reward to my kids for hanging in on the long drives. But we couldn't, because 100 kids followed us to every store. So we couldn't go buy expensive chocolates, but yeah.
Rudi, do you have a way that you prepare?
Well, when you know the people that you're working with, then the ritual is basically our own rituals that we create. You know, you put on your costume, you check the props, and then what I learned is that you enter as a group, that your safety in numbers, and also you're bigger when you are more than just one person. So we started to do processions. So if we had musical instruments, we would play the musical instruments. And then we started, when I was spearheading the Chiapas expeditions, I would spend time with the people that I was working with to kind of create a sort of a big entrance I remember one time, just we had like a big blue tarp, and we just said, "Hey, everyone, get under the tarp," and just and so we kind of like entered like a dragon, and you didn't see anything except our feet, and we just were playing music and sound effects. And the way that we introduce the characters is like, the last person underneath the tarp, they would like set up like a little installation. Like, for example, I had like all the suitcases. So when the tarp finally, so if we're like 3 people and here's the tarp, and the tarp would go, the last person, could be revealed. And so I would be sitting there having like a little tea party by myself, sitting on my suitcase, and then realize that I'm exposed, and I go under the thing, and then another person would. So we were very inventive how we presented ourselves, and of course we always knew where we were going to perform and where things were going to set up. Over here is where we're going to put all the props, and the audience is going to be here. So and for the end of a show, we also realized that at the end of the show, the children are more brave because the show's over and you're not going to use them as a volunteer. So they are very fearless of coming up and grabbing your stuff. So we realized that if we have a decoy, meaning, if there's 3 clowns, then 1 clown is responsible for packing and getting everything in suitcases. And the other 2 clowns would like do something in the audience. And then when, they would look and say, okay, everything's packed up, and then we could all leave together. So this is something that we kind of realize as just not necessarily a safety measure, but it's just like, when you have, 100, 200, kids, going on stage and wanting to, throw your juggling club, you're never going to see that club again. So, and we have another show, down the road. So we've got to really kind of protect our equipment. And so that was kind of one thing we did. And then later on, we started doing, like, if we had the time, we would just like do little, impromptu workshops. We would do pyramids, and depending on who who were in the company, they would, just start playing with the kids. And so that oftentimes was even much more, you felt like it was, you had them there, and they were like, eating out of your hands. You asked them to do stuff, and and that was really great. But it takes really a lot of energy, especially after you've done a show, to have the patience to kind of organize and get people to do, a huge pyramid, or, get them to like, balance bamboo sticks or whatever.
I want to know about an especially sweet memory. What was a moment that was especially good, and that still feels really present, and either of performing or one of those post-show moments?
I remember actually the very first project with the 3 of us, and we didn't have a show together, but we were all solo performers, and Moshe and Rudi would improvise forever, and I would try to keep up. And Moshe practiced that leadership of set an example, teach, and then go away, so they have to do it on their own. So we did just about the whole second half of the trip without Moshe. And I remember some of those first shows with just me and Rudi on our own were so sweet. I think the very first one, we were just in front of that church, and the crowd was so shy and so with us, and I don't know, it was just so beautiful. That's not much of a story.
The Namaste story always stays with me. I was just recalling how when we went to Oventique in '96, and we had faxed the community that we were coming, This was the first time that anybody had come there since the Zapatista Revolution to do a show, or maybe ever. And there was quite a ritual of being accepted. You know, they wanted to search our car, they wanted to look at our passports before they'd let us in. We spent the night in this kind of barn structure after meeting these 4 masked people who wanted to know why we were there, even though they had received a fax about the show. And then they formally gave us permission to do the show after our workday the next day. And it was amazing to watch that community come in down the hill together to sit down to watch the show, because they really came in with a lot of respect, and they mostly didn't have many sets of clothes, but you could tell they took time to make themselves really look presentable. They weren't just like in their work clothes. The next morning, they really appreciated our presence. And the next morning, they said to us when we were leaving, first they cooked us breakfast, which was surprising, in this little hut, which was very smoky. And it was a combination of leftover pasta and beans and eggs. But then they said, they didn't say, they say, mi casa es tu casa. My house is your house. They said, mi campo es tu campo. Our land is your land. And then they said, you can come and cook and stay here whenever you want, in Spanish. And it was very special.
This one always makes me cry. So.
Oh, good. I bet me too then.
I was with David, and we were in Yibetho, and this was a camp, a displacement camp. So there was some violence, and all these people who had to flee their village, and they were in this camp, which was basically a big mud pit. And I had been there, this is the first time, I think. So I'm there, and this is, David and I are performing, and we're doing the duo, and I keep telling him, kick me in the butt, kick me in the butt. So we finally end our show, and there was an old woman who came up to me, and she was really emotional, and I thought she was angry. And she was like, she was talking, and she wasn't speaking in Spanish, so I didn't understand her. She was speaking in her indigenous language. And I was like really kind of like, oh, I must have offended her. Something happened to her. And then someone said, and told me in Spanish, do you want me to translate? And I said, yeah, please. She says, she's asking you not to leave. She says, please don't go, don't go. I'm afraid if you go, something bad is going to happen. When you're here, I feel so much better. Please don't go, please don't go. And the woman was translating for me, and I just started kind of like, I started getting emotional too. And I told her, I said, I promise I'm going to come back. I promise. And so, of course, I made a promise, and I kept my promise. And I remember every time I come back to Mexico to perform for anybody, I always remember this woman. And I have this feeling of, a promise is a promise. And so I remember when David and I were walking back up the hill to our car, there was like these little pieces of red string that they kind of macrame bracelets, which, are very, very typical. And I remember just picking, strands up. And I remember in the car back that I wrapped one around my wrist. And I go, now this is going to remind me of this moment. And this is going to remind me of how sacred the work we do and how important it is. And, I'm never going to stop. And a promise is a promise. And I always find these red strings, and sometimes I collect them. So I go, when this one breaks, I have another one. So every time I go to Chiapas, I'm always got my eyes looking on the ground for these little pieces of string.
Oh.
Wow.
Well, Rudy, we've been to Ibelho. I went to Ibelho in 2001 with Bernie, the Zen master. So we've been going back there, and she was right, because was that before or after the massacre in Acteal?
It was after.
Yeah.
So how do you balance the playful part of the work with the mournful part of the work, and the balance of the lightness, and then also in all of your stories are the reason that we're there, which is often due to violence and displacement. And how do you balance that? I saved the easy questions for that. Moshe.
Well, I think in the early years I didn't know to balance it. It was just my joy and my drive that just kept me going. At some point, I did hit a bit of a burnout, like I did too much. And so I think in later years, people started to become more balanced and to really look to find. We started asking. I know that it became a demand that the groups would meet after the shows, or at least every day, and check in with each other to see how each other was doing, and to have some type of support system between the artists at the very least. Nowadays, I have a very different perspective, or a wider perspective, but back then, I didn't.
In the early days, we we didn't really talk that over as a group too much while we were there, I don't think.
No.
And I would find that I would not deal with that until I got home afterwards, because I would just be completely in the moment, performing, and then resting away, and then kind of process when I got home. And I remember I was in the first project in Haiti after the quake, just the most intense one of my life, I think. And we just went and went for 16 days. The demand was infinite. Over and over, people telling us, I haven't seen that girl smile since we pulled her mom out from the rubble and things like that. And then when I got home, I was exhausted for a couple months, actually. And so I had to work through all that. Yeah.
Have a big heart. If you have a big heart, you have space for joy and sorrow. And you know, this work that we do, it's not for everyone. You know, there are people who are great performers, and they, you know, it's romantic to go and perform and, you know, put it on their, you know, bucket list, and then they don't do it again because they don't have the capacity possibly, or they don't have the heart, or they just wanted to do it just because, yeah, you know, it was fancy, it was romantic. So I think that the people who continue to do this work, they have a special DNA inside them, and that helps them. And what's really important is to feel like your family, you know, the people that you're on tour with, they're a family that you can, you know, be angry and, you know, but at the same time, it's you know, one of my rules when I'm the team leader is, you know, you have to respect, you know, whatever the situation is, you have to be respectful. If you're angry at me, be respectful and tell me why you're angry, and, you know, don't let it escalate. So the idea of finding a balance is, you know, I don't think everyone can do this work, and that's fine. and it's fine if people are curious to go on one tour, that's fine too. But the ones who continue to do it, they have the DNA and they have a big heart, and that's enables them to be able to filter stuff, not take it too personal, and do the work. And you can have a beer afterwards with your people, and you can cry then. I remember when I was in Turkey just recently, a couple of years ago. This was right after the bombings in Paris, and all the violence that was happening, and it also happened here. I went basically to the Syrian border, and we were performing for Kurdish communities. And I remember we went to this one center, and they told us that we don't know how it's going to go, because like 2 months before, there was an attack there, and there was someone came into the compound and exploded a bomb that killed people that the people who organized it and who were on tour with us knew, and they were killed. And so I remember going there and knowing this story, and we were trying to figure out where we were going to perform, and then there was this stage, and I went over to the stage, and there were all these little big, well, this is little, but if you can imagine a bomb exploding, there were like pockmark all over the stage, the wall of the stage, and I was just like, I just couldn't believe it. But I realized that we had to perform there. We had to cleanse what had happened there with the performance. And so we performed there, and we had a huge crowd. But before and after the performance, it was really incredibly emotional. And people were crying, and the fact that they could cry and be surrounded by people who were strong enough to comfort them was important as well. So, yeah. But we must speak about the machetes.
Machete story.
Okay, I guess we'll tell
What
the
about the
machete.
lassos?
We have a lasso story, a machete story, and then we're going
on that Haiti trip, we handled it evening. It was me, Dave Clay, and Leah Abel, and we were not so much physical theater touchy-feely people, but we would have these black humor conversations, and we would just laugh and laugh and laugh at nighttime. And the medical people that we were staying with were like medical volunteers from Central America, France, and Spain. Sometimes thought we were kind of crazy because we would just laugh and laugh and laugh.
We are crazy.
Oh, crazy. Okay, Moshe, you want to you can tell it.
What story? Oh, I don't remember. I remember David and Rudi, something about a lasso and lassoing this guy.
Tim Cunningham, yeah.
I'll tell you my machete story, and then David, you can tell him the other one that you were involved in, the tour where your kids were on tour with us.
Well, we might not have to tell those stories. This is.
Go ahead, Rudi.
Okay, I'll go first. We were, real quickly, because I know that we're running short on time. We were performing in the state of Tabasco, and there was a baseball game. So we had to wait for the baseball game to be over because all the people were at the baseball game. So we're at the baseball game drinking warm beer because everyone's drinking warm beer. And then the game ended. Okay, let's go back over to the town square and let's set up for the performance. So people were coming forward, improvising. And, one of the audience members was this old man sitting on a horse. And, typically, clowns make fun of people of high status. So someone probably I think it was probably Mr. Cunningham, who probably insulted him somehow by like pretending to be him on a horse. And so the guy just kind of like left, and we didn't think anything of it. We gather this huge crowd and we start performing. And right in the middle of the newspaper routine, this man returns on his horse and he has a lasso. And he kind of like pushes his horse past the perimeter of the audience. And he took out his lasso and he started swinging it. And I'm doing sound effects, and Tim Cunningham and Jane Chen were doing the newspaper routine, and I saw him launching the lasso at Tim, who was sitting on the suitcase, and I remember like in slow motion saying, "Tim, look out!" And this lasso in slow motion comes and it lands right around him. This guy, it was an amazing throw. And he started pulling the lasso, and Tim, as a clown, was reacting like a clown, like, "Oh, a lasso, what should I do? Oh no, he's going to get me." And so as he's doing his clown bit, this man actually grabbed him by his leg, and Tim was actually caught. And this man has the rope wrapped around the holster of the horse, and the horse is backing up, and Tim is sliding across the basketball court, and we're just like going, "What the fuck?" So, of course, the clowns get into action. They go over and we play tug of war with this man. And then some people from the audience help because, it's a horse that's pulling Tim. Finally, Tim, we get the lasso out of the old man's hands, and Tim gets out of the rope, and he's freaked out. And then I was so pissed off at this man that I gathered the rope, and the man started shouting, "Give me back my rope, give me back my rope." And I was going, I wasn't speaking, I was still in my clown character, and I was just like going, "I'm not gonna give it back to you." And so he took out his machete, and he's on a fucking horse. He starts walking towards me with a machete, and I have the rope. And so what does a clown do? Well, we do a chase scene, of course. And I'm not running like an athlete. I'm running like a clown with a big thing of rope, and this guy with, chasing on a slippery basketball court. And it was kind of very, very scary. And so at a certain point, I just was like on one side of the basketball pole, and he was on the other. And if he moved this way, I would move this way. So there was always going to be something. And so finally, some guy came up to me and says, "He's really angry. You should give him back his rope." And I was like going, "Oh, okay." But I didn't give him back the rope. I gave it to this guy, and then the guy gave him the rope, and then the guy left, and it was just like, and then it was like, "Okay, let's start the show back again." And then we looked around and we couldn't find the other clown, Jane Chen. We're like going, "Where is she? Where is she?" And she was like hiding in the audience, like, And finally she comes back out and it's like, "Okay, let's keep doing the newspaper routine." And it was just like, how do I do this?
And the early days of Clowns Without Borders. We are at an hour.
The other machete story then.
We'll save that. We'll save that. The early days of Clowns Without Borders. Rudi, Moshe, and David, thank you so much.
These Clowns Without Borders memories still float me above the clouds. And namaste to everybody get involved. And Naomi, Executive Director of Clowns Without Borders, thank you for doing the organizing work. It's always the behind the scenes organizing work that's less rewarding and harder to do. With Moshe doing a namaste for everybody to to participate in.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Naomi.